I thought pain ended with the fire, but their silence burned even deeper. My sister stormed into the house and violently grabbed a scalding iron from my hand, pressing it directly onto my face while I screamed in agony. As I desperately tried to fight her off, my mom came running and physically held me still, laughing sadistically. "Don't you dare resist her. Can't you see our precious angel is upset? She absolutely deserves to take all her anger out on worthless trash like you." My dad rushed over to comfort my sister and furiously screamed at me. "Be grateful it was only your hideous face, you pathetic waste. If it were me holding that iron, I would have burned your entire body." I stayed completely silent, secretly photographed everything, and called 911. Within 1 hour, I had systematically destroyed their entire existence. I'm Natasha, and this is the story of how my family's golden child treatment of my sister Chloe finally came to an end in the most spectacular way possible. For 25 years, I've been the family scapegoat, while Chloe, 3 years younger at 22, has been treated like royalty. But what happened last Tuesday changed everything forever. Let me paint you a picture of my family dynamic first. My parents, Beverly and Harold, have always made it crystal clear that Chloe was their precious princess while I was just the disappointing older daughter who existed to make their favorite look better. Chloe got a brand new Honda Civic for her 16th birthday while I got a lecture about being grateful for having a roof over my head. Chloe's college tuition was paid in full while I worked 3 jobs to pay for community college. When Chloe wanted to pursue her art career after graduation, they funded her expensive studio apartment downtown. When I graduated with my nursing degree, they forgot to even congratulate me. The favoritism wasn't just about money. Every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone revolved around Chloe. If Chloe was upset about something, the entire household had to walk on eggshells. If I was having problems, I was told to stop being dramatic and figure it out myself. Chloe could do no wrong and I could do no right. I'd been living at home for the past year, saving money while working as a registered nurse at the regional medical center. After completing my 4-year nursing program and passing my licensing exam 2 years ago, I'd been working to build my career and save for independence. The plan was to move out once I had enough saved for a decent apartment and some emergency funds. Chloe, meanwhile, had dropped out of college after 2 years and moved back home 8 months ago after her latest boyfriend dumped her and she couldn't afford rent on her own. Of course, my parents welcomed her with open arms and immediately started coddling her like she was a heartbroken teenager instead of a 22-year-old adult. The incident happened on a Tuesday evening. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital and came home exhausted. All I wanted was to iron my scrubs for the next day and get some sleep. I was in the laundry room peacefully ironing my uniform while listening to a podcast when Chloe came storming in like a tornado. She'd apparently had another fight with her on-again, off-again boyfriend Jake and she was in one of her legendary rages. Without any warning, she grabbed the hot iron right out of my hand and pressed it against the left side of my face. The pain was excruciating. The searing heat against my cheek felt like my skin was burning through multiple layers. I screamed and instinctively tried to push her away, but Chloe was in a complete frenzy. She kept trying to hit me with the iron while I desperately tried to defend myself. The acrid smell of burned skin filled the air and I could feel the immediate damage to my face. That's when my mother came running into the laundry room. For a split second, I thought she was going to help me. Instead, she grabbed me by the shoulders and yanked me backward away from Chloe. "Don't you dare say anything to her." Mom screamed at me, her face twisted with anger. "Can't you see she's upset? She needs to take her anger out on someone and frankly trash like you deserves it." Then she started laughing. Actually laughing at my burned face while I stood there in shock. My hand pressed against my throbbing cheek. My father came running in next, took one look at the situation, and immediately went to comfort Chloe, who had started crying crocodile tears about how Jake had hurt her feelings. Dad wrapped her in a hug while she sobbed dramatically about her broken heart. Then he turned to me with pure hatred in his eyes. "You better be glad it was just your ugly face," he snarled. "If it was me dealing with you, I would have burned something else." Maybe next time you'll think twice before existing in the same space as your sister when she's upset. I stood there in complete shock, my face throbbing with pain, while my parents continued to comfort Chloe like she was the victim. The iron was still hot on the floor where she dropped it, and I could see some burned skin and fabric fibers stuck to its surface. But here's the thing about being the family scapegoat for 25 years. You learn to be resourceful. You learn to document things because no one believes you when you try to explain how badly you're treated. You learn to be prepared because you know no one else is going to protect you. So, while my parents were fussing over Chloe and telling her what a perfect angel she was, I quietly went to my room and did 3 things. I took detailed photos of my burned face from multiple angles. I took photos of the iron with my skin still stuck to it. And I recorded a voice memo describing exactly what had happened while the details were fresh and my voice was shaking with adrenaline. Then I called 911. The paramedics arrived first, followed closely by 2 police officers. My parents were absolutely stunned when the EMTs came through the front door asking for the assault victim. Chloe went pale as a sheet when she realized I had actually called for help. "Natasha, what have you done?" Mom hissed at me while the paramedic examined my face. "I reported an assault," I said calmly, even though my whole body was trembling. "Because that's what this was." The burn was classified as a severe second-degree burn covering about 3 inches of my left cheek. The paramedic said I was lucky Chloe hadn't held the iron against my face longer or the damage could have been much worse. As it was, I would definitely need specialized treatment and would likely have some permanent scarring. While I was being treated, the police officers were taking statements. Chloe tried to claim it was an accident, that she'd just been reaching for something and had gotten in the way, but the photos I'd taken told a different story. You could see the clear outline of the iron surface on my face, and the angle made it obvious this wasn't some accidental bump. My parents tried to minimize what happened, calling it a family dispute and suggesting that I was overreacting. They kept emphasizing how upset Chloe had been about her boyfriend troubles like that somehow justified assault with a dangerous object. But the officers weren't buying it, especially when they saw the iron with burned skin and fabric still stuck to it and heard my recorded statement describing exactly how Chloe had grabbed the iron and deliberately pressed it against my face. Chloe was arrested that night for aggravated assault and aggravated battery. My parents were so shocked they could barely speak. They kept insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that family problems should be handled within the family. "She's your sister." Dad kept shouting at me as they put handcuffs on Chloe. "How could you do this to your own family?" I looked him straight in the eye and said, "She stopped being my sister the moment she decided to use a hot iron as a weapon. And you stopped being my parents the moment you told her she deserved to take her anger out on me." The next few days were absolute chaos. Chloe was released on bail, but she had to stay away from me as part of a protective order. My parents took out a substantial loan against their house to pay for her lawyer, convinced they could make this whole thing go away. But I wasn't backing down. Not this time. The photos of my face were horrific. The burn covered most of my left cheek, and even with proper medical treatment, the doctor said I'd have permanent scarring. I had to take 3 weeks off work while it healed, losing income one couldn't afford to lose. My extended family started taking sides once word got out. Most of them had witnessed years of Chloe's golden child treatment and my parents' favoritism, so they weren't exactly surprised that things had escalated to violence. My Aunt Lorraine, my mom's sister, was particularly outspoken about how disgusted she was with my parents' reaction. "I always knew Beverly spoiled Chloe rotten," she told me over the phone, "but I never thought she'd literally stand by and laugh while one daughter burned the other's face off. That's psychotic." Chloe's arrest made the regional news because aggravated assault is serious business in our mid-sized city. The headline read, "Local woman assaults sister with hot iron during family dispute." Chloe was mortified that everyone knew what she'd done, especially since she'd always prided herself on her perfect reputation. My parents went into full damage control mode, trying to convince everyone who would listen that I was the real problem. They claimed I'd always been jealous of Chloe and had fabricated the whole thing for attention. They said I was a vindictive liar who was trying to destroy an innocent girl's life over a simple accident. But the evidence was overwhelming. The photos, the recording, the physical evidence of my skin on the iron, and the witness statements from the paramedics about the severity and deliberate nature of the burn painted a clear picture. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Janet Mills who had seen her share of domestic violence cases. She took one look at the evidence and told me she was going to push for a substantial penalty. This wasn't a crime of passion, she explained to me during our first meeting. This was a deliberate, calculated assault using a dangerous object that could have caused permanent disfigurement or disability. The fact that your own parents encouraged and laughed about it makes it even more disturbing. Chloe's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Janet wasn't having it. She wanted this case to go to trial as an example of how seriously the state takes domestic violence, even between family members. The trial was scheduled for 3 months later, which gave me time to prepare. I moved out of my parents' house immediately and found a small apartment across town. My parents didn't even try to stop me. They were so focused on protecting Chloe. During those 3 months, the family dynamics completely shifted. Extended family members who had stayed neutral for years suddenly started speaking up about Chloe's behavior and my parents' favoritism. Stories came out about incidents I'd never even known about. My cousin Michelle told me about the time Chloe had deliberately broken her grandmother's antique vase during a tantrum and blamed it on the family dog. My uncle David remembered when Chloe had keyed his car because he'd given me a graduation gift and not her. Story after story emerged of Chloe's entitled behavior and my parents' refusal to hold her accountable. Meanwhile, Chloe's life was falling apart. The assault charges meant she couldn't get the teaching job she'd been hoping for. Her friends started distancing themselves once they learned what she'd done. Jake, the boyfriend she'd been fighting about, heard about the incident and broke up with her permanently, saying he didn't want to date someone capable of that kind of violence. My parents' reputation in the community was also suffering. Dad worked as a manager at a local manufacturing plant, and word had gotten around about what happened. His co-workers started looking at him differently, wondering what kind of man would tell his daughter she deserved to be burned. Mom's book club and church friends were equally horrified. During the preparation phase for the trial, my lawyer, Monica Castillo, discovered something that would make our case even stronger. She subpoenaed Chloe's phone records and found text messages between Chloe and her friend Ashley from the night of the assault. The messages were sent just 20 minutes after the police had left our house. Chloe had texted, "I can't believe she actually called the cops on me. I barely touched her ugly face with the iron. She's always been such a drama queen. Mom and Dad will fix this like they always do." Ashley had responded, "Wait, you actually burned her with an iron? Chloe, that's insane." Chloe's reply was chilling. "She had it coming. I've wanted to hurt her for years. She thinks she's so much better than me just because she became a nurse. At least now she'll have to explain to everyone why her face looks like a piece of burnt toast." Monica also found social media posts Chloe had made in the weeks leading up to the assault. On Facebook, she posted things like, "Some people just exist to make others miserable," with crying laughing emojis, and "When your sister is literally the worst human being alive, but your parents force you to live with her." These posts helped establish a pattern of premeditation and malice. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Chloe's ex-boyfriend Jake, feeling guilty about his role in her emotional state that night, came forward with his own story. He told Monica that Chloe had called him right before the assault, screaming about how she was going to make someone pay for their breakup. He said she'd specifically mentioned wanting to hurt me because I was an easy target who never fights back. She told me she was going to find something to really mess up Natasha's face, Jake testified in his deposition. "I thought she was just being dramatic like always. I never thought she'd actually do something that crazy." Meanwhile, the family dynamics were continuing to deteriorate in spectacular fashion. My parents had initially tried to maintain their social connections, but the community response was swift and brutal. Mom's church prayer group politely asked her not to return. Dad's bowling league found a replacement for his spot on the team. Neighbors who had known our family for decades suddenly seemed too busy to chat when they saw my parents outside. The local newspaper, which had initially run a brief story about the arrest, decided to do a follow-up piece about domestic violence within families. They interviewed me extensively about the long history of favoritism and emotional abuse. And the article painted a damning picture of parents who had essentially groomed one child to be an abuser while conditioning the other to be a victim. The article included quotes from neighbors and family friends who had witnessed years of problematic behavior. Mrs. Henderson, our next-door neighbor, told the reporter about the time she'd seen Chloe throw a full can of soda at my head because I parked in her spot in the driveway. Mr. Thompson from down the street recalled overhearing my parents laughing about how I'd never amount to anything while praising Chloe's artistic spirit and free-spirited nature. Most shocking was the testimony from my high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Chen, who had tried multiple times to report concerns about my home life to Child Protective Services. She revealed that I'd come to school with suspicious bruises and injuries several times and that my parents had always had elaborate explanations that didn't quite add up. The system had failed me then, but now these documented concerns were coming back to haunt my family. Chloe had been fired from her part-time job at a boutique after customers complained about her hostile attitude. She'd gained significant weight due to stress eating and had started drinking heavily. My parents were spending thousands of dollars on therapy sessions for her, trying to build a mental health defense, but Chloe kept sabotaging herself by making angry posts on social media about how unfair everything was. One particularly damaging Instagram post showed Chloe at a bar with a caption, "When your psycho sister tries to ruin your life over a tiny accident, but you know the truth will come out in court." Nail polish emoji. Sparkles emoji. #family drama #innocent. The prosecutor later used this post to demonstrate Chloe's complete lack of remorse or understanding of the seriousness of her actions. I was also dealing with the psychological aftermath of the assault and years of abuse. My therapist, Dr. Novak, helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just sibling rivalry or normal family dysfunction. It was systematic emotional and physical abuse that had escalated to assault with a deadly weapon. She explained how my parents had created a family system where Chloe was allowed and even encouraged to use me as an emotional punching bag. "Your parents essentially taught Chloe that you were less valuable than she was," Dr. Novak explained during one of our sessions. "They communicated that your feelings, your safety, and your well-being didn't matter. When they laughed at your burned face and told Chloe she deserved to hurt you, they were reinforcing 22 years of this toxic dynamic." The therapy sessions were painful but necessary. I had to confront the reality that my parents had never loved me the way parents should love their children. They had seen me as expendable, as existing primarily to make Chloe feel better about herself. The iron incident wasn't an isolated moment of violence. It was the inevitable culmination of years of dehumanization. As we got closer to the trial date, my parents made increasingly desperate attempts to convince me to drop the charges. They tried bribing me, offering to pay for my medical expenses if I would just let this family matter stay in the family. When that didn't work, they tried guilt, sending me long letters about how I was destroying Chloe's future over a moment of poor judgment. The most manipulative attempt came when they convinced my elderly grandmother to call me. Grandma Rose, my mom's mother, had always been kind to me, and I think my parents hoped she could talk sense into me. But when I explained to her exactly what had happened that night, the deliberate nature of the assault, my parents' reaction, their refusal to get me immediate medical help, she was horrified. "Beverly never told me it was that bad," Grandma Rose said, her voice shaking. "She made it sound like an accident, like you girls had just gotten into a little tussle. I can't believe my daughter laughed at you while you were injured. That's not the woman I raised." From that point forward, Grandma Rose became one of my strongest supporters. She started telling other family members the true story of what had happened, which led to even more isolation for my parents. Extended family members who had initially stayed neutral began openly condemning my parents' behavior. The financial pressure was also mounting for my parents. Chloe's legal fees were enormous, and they'd already taken the loan against their house to pay for her defense. Dad had to start working overtime at the plant, which meant he was constantly exhausted and stressed. Mom had to take on additional bookkeeping clients, but she was losing existing clients faster than she could replace them due to the negative publicity. Their marriage was also suffering under the strain. I heard from my Aunt Lorraine that they'd been fighting constantly, with each parent blaming the other for how things had gotten so out of hand. Dad apparently blamed Mom for coddling Chloe too much, while Mom blamed Dad for not supporting the family enough during this difficult time. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were finally experiencing the kind of family conflict and dysfunction they'd subjected me to my entire life. Chloe herself had started showing signs of genuine panic as the reality of her situation set in. Her lawyer had been honest with her about the likely outcome of the trial given the overwhelming evidence against her. She was facing serious prison time and her privileged life was about to come crashing down around her. In a last-ditch effort to avoid trial, Chloe's lawyer reached out to Monica about a possible plea deal. Chloe was willing to plead guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for probation and anger management classes. She would also agree to pay my medical expenses and issue a public apology. Monica brought the offer to me, but I rejected it immediately. She deliberately burned my face with a hot iron while my parents cheered her on, I told Monica. I'm not interested in helping her avoid the consequences of her actions. If she was truly sorry, she would have apologized immediately instead of posting on social media about how I'm a psychodrama queen. The decision felt empowering. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being pressured to make things easier for Chloe or to prioritize her comfort over my own justice. I was finally in control of my own narrative. The trial finally arrived in late spring. I took the stand first, walking the jury through exactly what had happened that night. I showed them the photos of my burned face, played the recording I'd made immediately afterward, and explained the years of favoritism and abuse that had led up to this moment. Chloe's lawyer tried to paint me as a jealous older sister who had exaggerated an accident, but the evidence was too strong. The photos of my face, the skin on the iron, and the testimony from the paramedics about the nature of the burn made it clear this was no accident. When Chloe took the stand, she tried to claim temporary insanity due to her breakup with Jake. She sobbed and talked about how devastated she'd been and how she'd just lost control for a moment. But the prosecutor pointed out that she'd specifically sought out the iron, grabbed it from my hand, and deliberately pressed it against my face. That level of deliberate action couldn't be explained away by temporary emotional distress. The most damaging testimony came when the prosecutor called my mother to the stand. Janet Mills had subpoenaed her specifically to address the family's reaction to the assault. Mrs. Patterson, the prosecutor asked, when you entered the laundry room and saw your daughter Natasha with a burned face, what was your immediate reaction? Mom tried to claim she didn't remember exactly what she'd said. But Janet was prepared. She played a portion of the 911 call where you could hear Mom in the background saying, she deserved what happened to her. Does that refresh your memory, Mrs. Patterson? Do you recall telling your daughter Chloe that she needed to take her anger out on trash like Natasha? The courtroom was silent as my mother squirmed on the stand. She eventually admitted that she'd said those things, but claimed she'd been in shock and didn't mean them. And do you recall laughing while your daughter Natasha stood there with a second-degree burn on her face? Another long pause. I may have been nervous laughing. It wasn't because I thought it was funny. Janet wasn't done. Mrs. Patterson, in your opinion, did your daughter Natasha deserve to be burned with a hot iron? Of course not, Mom said weakly. But that's what you told Chloe at the time, isn't it? That Natasha deserved it. I was upset. I didn't mean it. The jury looked disgusted. You could see it on their faces. They couldn't believe a mother would react that way to one child assaulting another. Dad's testimony was even worse. He stuck by his statement that I should be glad it was just my face and tried to justify it by saying he was just trying to de-escalate the situation. The prosecutor asked him to explain how threatening to burn other parts of his daughter's body could be considered de-escalation, and he couldn't give a coherent answer. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Chloe was found guilty of aggravated assault and aggravated battery and sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by 2 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay for my medical expenses and attend anger management classes. But the criminal case was just the beginning. I filed a civil lawsuit against Chloe for damages, including medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, and the cost of plastic surgery to minimize the scarring. My lawyer also included claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress, naming my parents as co-defendants for their role in encouraging and enabling the assault. The weeks following Chloe's conviction were a whirlwind of media attention and community reaction. Our small town wasn't used to this kind of sensational family drama, and the case had captured everyone's attention. The local news station did a follow-up story about the sentencing, interviewing community members about domestic violence and family abuse. Several of my former teachers reached out to me after seeing the news coverage. My high school English teacher, Mrs. Morales, sent me a heartfelt letter explaining that she'd always suspected something was wrong at home, but hadn't known how to help. She described how I'd often seemed withdrawn and anxious, and how my parents had always seemed dismissive of my achievements during parent-teacher conferences. "Your sister would get praised for turning in a barely passing assignment," she wrote, "while your honor roll grades were met with indifference. I should have said something then, and I'm sorry I didn't." The validation from these adults who had witnessed my family dynamics during my formative years was incredibly healing. It confirmed that the abuse hadn't been subtle or invisible. It had been obvious to outsiders, which made my parents' gaslighting all the more cruel. Meanwhile, Chloe was struggling to cope with her new reality. The county jail where she was being held pending transfer to state prison was a harsh wake-up call. She was no longer the pampered princess who had everything handed to her. She was now inmate number 47,291, sharing a cell with women who had committed similar violent crimes. My parents were allowed to visit her twice a week, and according to other inmates' family members who knew our story, these visits were dramatic affairs. Chloe would cry and scream about how unfair everything was, demanding that my parents find a way to fix the situation. She couldn't understand why her tears and tantrums weren't working like they had her entire life. The other inmates weren't impressed by Chloe's entitled attitude. Word had gotten around about why she was there. And burning someone's face with an iron was considered particularly cruel, even by jail standards. Several women told their visiting family members that Chloe was getting a reality check about how the world actually works when you don't have parents protecting you from consequences. My parents were also struggling with their new social status as pariahs. Dad's work situation had become increasingly uncomfortable. His supervisor, Tom Bradley, had been friends with him for over 15 years. But even Tom was having trouble maintaining the relationship after learning about his reaction to my assault. "I just can't understand how a father could tell his daughter she deserved to be burned," Tom told other coworkers, according to my friend Lisa, whose husband also worked at the plant. "It's changed how I see Bob as a person." How do you work alongside someone who thinks that way about their own child? The isolation was getting to my parents in different ways. Mom had always been very social, organizing book club meetings and church fundraisers. Now she spent most of her time alone in the house, obsessively reading online legal forums and trying to find some way to appeal Chloe's conviction. She'd lost significant weight and looked years older than she had just 6 months earlier. Dad, on the other hand, seemed to be getting angrier rather than sadder. He'd apparently been telling anyone who would listen that I was an ungrateful daughter who had destroyed the family over one little mistake. He seemed genuinely unable to understand why everyone was treating them like criminals when in his mind they'd just been supporting their struggling daughter. The financial pressure was becoming unbearable for them. In addition to Chloe's legal fees, they now had to deal with my civil lawsuit, which was seeking damages that would likely exceed their ability to pay. Their lawyer had advised them to consider bankruptcy, but Dad was too proud to admit that level of financial defeat. They'd started selling off family heirlooms and valuable possessions to raise money. Mom's grandmother's china set, Dad's vintage guitar collection, even Chloe's old trophies and awards. Everything was being sold on eBay or at garage sales. Neighbors told me they'd seen my parents loading boxes of belongings into their car for trips to the pawn shop. The house itself was deteriorating because they couldn't afford proper maintenance. The lawn was overgrown, the paint was peeling, and there were clear signs that they were struggling to keep up with basic upkeep. It was a visible symbol of how far their family had fallen. During this time, I was getting updates about Chloe's adjustment to prison through my lawyer. Chloe had been transferred to a medium-security women's facility about 3 hours from town. The transition had been brutal for someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. Prison culture doesn't tolerate the kind of manipulative behavior Chloe had used her entire life. When she tried to play victim and get special treatment from guards or other inmates, she was quickly shut down. When she threw tantrums about the food or accommodations, she was put in solitary confinement. The harsh reality of institutional life was forcing her to confront her behavior in ways my parents had never required. Her cellmate, according to reports from my lawyer's contact in the prison system, was a woman named Maria, who had been convicted of armed robbery. Maria apparently had little patience for Chloe's constant complaining and self-pity. She'd reportedly told Chloe to grow up and take responsibility for burning your sister's face instead of acting like you're the victim here. Chloe had tried to write me several letters from prison, but I'd instructed the postal service to return them unopened. I wasn't interested in whatever manipulation or fake apologies she might be offering. According to my lawyer, she was also trying to contact extended family members, hoping someone would advocate for her or help my parents with legal expenses. Most of our relatives had completely cut ties with that side of the family by this point. Chloe's letters were returned unopened, and her phone calls weren't accepted. The family that had once revolved around protecting and accommodating her had finally seen her true nature and wanted nothing to do with it. The civil case was even more devastating than the criminal trial. In criminal court, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is very high. In civil court, it's just preponderance of evidence, more likely than not. And with all the evidence I had, it wasn't even close. The jury awarded me $180,000 in damages, far more than I'd expected. Chloe was responsible for $120,000 and my parents were jointly responsible for $60,000 for their intentional infliction of emotional distress. Chloe had virtually no assets, so collecting from her would be nearly impossible unless her future earnings were garnished. But my parents were forced to sell their house to pay their portion of the judgment. They ended up downsizing to a small rental apartment across town, and Dad had to cash out his retirement savings early to cover the remaining balance. The impact on their lives was immediate and devastating. Dad's employer, citing the negative publicity and his poor judgment, demoted him to a lower-paying position. Mom lost several clients from her part-time bookkeeping business when word spread about the trial. Their church community, which had been a huge part of their social life, largely shunned them. Chloe served 2 years in prison before being released on parole for good behavior. When she got out, she found that her world had completely changed. Her teaching certification had been revoked due to the felony conviction. Her friends had moved on. Jake had married someone else. My parents had lost their house and could barely support themselves, let alone help her get back on her feet. Meanwhile, my life was improving dramatically. The settlement money allowed me to get the best plastic surgery available to minimize the scarring on my face. While I still have some visible marks, they're much less noticeable than they would have been without treatment. I used the rest of the money as a down payment on a beautiful condo and invested the remainder. I also started attending therapy to process years of family trauma and abuse. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free from their toxic dynamic. The extended family completely cut ties with my parents after the trial. No one wanted to associate with people who would encourage one child to assault another. Holidays, birthdays, and family gatherings all excluded them. They became pariahs in their own family. About a year after Chloe was released from prison, she tried to contact me through a mutual acquaintance. She wanted to talk things through and rebuild our relationship. She claimed she'd learned a lot in prison and wanted to make amends. I declined. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. And some people don't deserve forgiveness, especially when they've never shown genuine remorse for their actions. My parents also tried reaching out a few times, usually when they were struggling financially or socially, and thought I might help them. Each time I reminded them of what they'd said and done that night. How they'd laughed at my burned face and told Chloe I deserved it. How they mortgaged their house to defend someone who'd assaulted me with a weapon rather than supporting their injured daughter. The last time Dad called me about 6 months ago, he was crying. He told me they'd been evicted from their apartment and were going to have to move in with my mom's elderly mother. He said they'd lost all their friends and that the family wouldn't speak to them. He begged me to help them, saying they were sorry for everything that had happened. "Were you my parents?" he pleaded. "Doesn't that mean anything to you?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. "You know what, Dad? You're right. It does mean something. It means you should have protected me instead of encouraging someone to burn my face. It means you should have gotten me medical help instead of telling me I deserved to be assaulted. It means you should have been parents to both your daughters, not just the one you liked better." I hung up and blocked his number. Today, nearly 4 years after that awful night, I'm thriving. I've been promoted to charge nurse at the hospital where I work. I bought a house in a different state and I'm engaged to a wonderful man who treats me with the respect and love I never got from my family. The scarring on my face has faded significantly, but I keep the photos from that night as a reminder of how far I've come. Sometimes people ask about the marks and I tell them the truth. I survived a family that preferred to sacrifice one child rather than hold their favorite accountable for her actions. Chloe is working at a grocery store and living in a studio apartment. She's had several more run-ins with the law for minor offenses and has struggled with substance abuse. My parents live in a senior housing complex and survive on Social Security and food stamps. They're essentially estranged from everyone who used to be in their lives. I don't take any pleasure in their suffering, but I also don't feel guilty about it. They made their choices that night when they decided to protect the person who assaulted me instead of the person who was injured. Every consequence they've faced since then flows directly from that decision. The night Chloe burned my face was the worst night of my life. But it was also the beginning of my real life. For the first time, I stood up for myself and demanded justice. I refused to be the family scapegoat anymore. I chose my own well-being over their comfort. And it changed everything. Sometimes people ask me if I regret calling the police that night, if I wish I'd handled it within the family like my parents wanted. The answer is absolutely not. That one phone call saved my life by ending a cycle of abuse that had gone on for decades. To anyone watching this who recognizes themselves in my story, you deserve better. You don't have to accept being treated as less than. You don't have to protect people who hurt you just because they're family. You have the right to demand justice and respect even from the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. Your family's dysfunction is not your responsibility to fix or endure. Sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is walk away and build a new life with people who actually value you. That's exactly what I did.